Welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility, an ongoing inquiry into American political origins and evolving institutions. The Executive Director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill O'Brien. He's also your host for this continuing conversation. Here he is now, Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Bob Kincaid, thank you so much for that introduction, and welcome to this Monday edition of the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. It is a sunny Monday here in southern West Virginia in the Appalachians. It is the 23rd day of March, excuse me. I'm looking at the sunshine and I'm thinking, I'm feeling in my bones March, but I'm seeing May. Anyway, it is a pleasure to be with you today on this, the 23rd day of March in the year 2015. I welcome you to a new week here at the Virtual Center. I want to again thank you for your faith in the Virtual Center and your continued loyalty to the Head On Radio Network and the programs that the Head On Radio Network brings to us each and every day, each and every week, each and every month. Thank you for your faith and your willingness to give up a portion of your time. All the data suggests that in today's contemporary world, it's becoming more and more true that time is probably the most important and valuable factor that most of us have. And the fact that you are willing to give a portion of your time to us here on a rather regular basis here at the Virtual Center is something that I take very seriously, and I'll be very honest with you, I cherish it very, very much. I'll do the best I can. As I've said this many times, I hope that I'm, at least for the most part, fulfilling this statement that I commit to doing everything that I can do to make the time that you do spend with us worthwhile for you. I hope that I can do that. I continue to work and do research and continue to read in hopes that I can continue to add to the information and to the level of understanding that all of us have on some of these complex issues that all of us face in this contemporary world. So I do want to thank you. I welcome you. I invite you to participate actively in our program by sharing your thoughts and your ideas and your concerns, suggestions, ideas with us here at the Virtual Center. We have a phone number dedicated to your interests in making yourself heard here at the Virtual Center. Our phone number is area code 304-663-4676. 304-663-4676. And as we said numerous times, 4676 on your keypad translates into HORN, H-O-R-N. And if you'd like to share your thoughts one-on-one with me via email, I'm more than happy to hear from you. I look forward to hearing from you, very honestly. My email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. That's waobrien, O-B-R-I-E-N, 906@gmail.com. Before we get into the substance of our program today, let me call your attention to the fact that today, this Monday, the 23rd, we will do our regular 2-hour program. But again, tomorrow being Tuesday, our program will be abbreviated. We'll begin 1/2 hour late. We'll start at 1:30 Eastern Time, and we'll still finish at 3 so that we can get out of here and make room for 3 o'clock program here on the Head On Radio Network. I do want to alert you to the fact that we will not be doing a live program on Wednesday. I have other obligations for another obligation on Wednesday that will take us into our program time. So I'm trusting that Bob Kincaid and his folks at Head On can maybe run a previous program with you from the Virtual Center. We now have a fairly rich library, if you will, of archived programs and portions of programs. An hour and a half on particular issues that that we can substitute when we are unable to do a live program, and such will be the case on Wednesday. So I'll try to remind you again tomorrow about that on Wednesday. But I just want to alert you. But we are here today. We are live as one can be, I guess, when you reach this stage of one's life. But as many people will tell me, still kicking, but not quite as high. It is a pleasure to be with you. Again, I invite you to participate actively in our program. I do want to continue the theme that we began to develop in our program last Wednesday, which is the tremendously expanded, rather invisible, and I'll get into this in a second, but not that visible role that the American Legislative Exchange Council, affectionately known as ALEC, ALEC, is playing in today's contemporary world. In the last several days, in fact, based on our programs from last week, from last Tuesday and Wednesday, on the American Legislative Exchange Council, and most specifically on ALEC's role in promoting an Article 5 convention to amend the Constitution of the United States by adopting a balanced budget amendment, which I might add, ALEC has drafted a model of. In other words, the balanced budget amendment that states are considering, and this we touched upon, we touched on this last Wednesday during our program. The balanced budget amendment, the specific details of that proposal were drafted by ALEC. And ALEC's members in the various state legislatures throughout the nation have taken it upon themselves to marshal that draft, that model legislation through the various state legislatures. And as I mentioned last Wednesday, the state of West Virginia, at the conclusion of its 60-day legislative session, which happened a week ago, last weekend, did indeed become the 27th state to adopt that model, that request for an Article 5 convention. That realization here in West Virginia is what got me back on the Article 5 issue. You'll remember that we spent quite a bit of time some months ago on the issue of a second constitutional convention and some of the forces, some of the elements in the nation that were behind it. We talked specifically, as you recall, about Mark Levin's book on the Liberty Amendments. In fact, we went through that book, went through each amendment one by one. And as I recall, there were 11. I may be incorrect in that, but maybe there are 11. There's a more recent book out, or not more recent, but a recent book out by an author named Frew, who talks about 10 particular amendments or changes, conservative changes that he believes would adjust or alter the Constitution of the United States and bring power back to the states and to local communities, theoretically enhancing freedom and liberty in America by reducing the role and the influence of the federal government. There's no question, and I think this will make sense to those of you who have been regular listeners here at the Virtual Center over time. There's no question that if you look at the context in toto of the kinds of amendments that are being proposed, whether it's Mark Levin's Liberty Amendments or Frew's amendments or whatever, what we're basically talking about is an effort to return to the period in the nation's history, which of course was when the nation was under the Articles of Confederation, prior to the calling of the Constitutional Convention, the drafting of the Constitution in the summer of 1787, and its submission for ratification to the states in late 1787 and into mid 1788. And then, of course, the calling Then we held the first federal elections under the Constitution in early 1789. President Washington was inaugurated as the first president. And from then on, the nation's central government under the Constitution of the United States basically begins to lay down the track record of the new federal government created under the Constitution of the United States. So for the period from 1776, from the Declaration of Independence, but more specifically from 1781, because while the Articles of Confederation was drafted by a committee convened or put together by the Continental Congress in 1776, the Articles of Confederation were not ratified until 1781. The holdout state was the state of Maryland. And the state of Maryland would not agree to sign on to the Articles of Confederation. And you'll recall that the Articles of Confederation required unanimous support of all 13 states in order to create the Confederation. Maryland was the holdout state. The issue on the table for Maryland was the control of Western lands. There were certain states, and of course, one of them was Virginia, of course, which borders on the state of Maryland. Virginia's land claims into the western parts of the continent extended so far that Maryland was concerned, and advisedly so, that the larger states, which had claims to Western lands under their charters, like Maryland and some of the other states that had extensive Western lands, would control in the long term, as the nation developed, would control the nation just by their size and the population within them. Maryland insisted that before it would sign on to the Articles of Confederation, it insisted that the states that claimed extensive Western land, specifically Virginia, agree to cede control of those lands to the new Congress under the Articles of Confederation. In other words, these lands would belong to all of the states in the Confederation, not just to a specific few. And Virginia finally adopted that that demand by Maryland in 1781, and the Articles of Confederation was finally adopted. But that's an aside. The issue that I would like to focus on for a moment right now is the fact that the Articles of Confederation created a government where the states remained independent and sovereign. In fact, the Articles of Confederation in Article 2 referred to the Confederation as a league of friendship among sovereign independent states. And so therefore, there was no such thing as the power of the central government over the states, because what power the central government was able, there really wasn't a central government, what power the Congress of the Confederation was able to exert was power that it relied on the states to give it. In other words, it took its marching orders from the states. There's absolutely no question that model, the idea of a confederation, is what these conservative amendments, proposed amendments to the Constitution of the United States, seem to have in mind. If all the amendments recommended by Mark Levin in his book The Liberty Amendments were adopted, then we would have a 21st century version of the Confederation, of the Articles of Confederation. We would not have a Supreme Court whose members would sit on good behavior for the lifetime, for their lives, for the extent of their lives. We would not have Supreme Court decisions that could not be overturned. We could not have congressional decisions that could not be overturned by state legislatures. In other words, the power that these amendments would confer would be power that would be exerted at the state level, but most specifically, they would be powers exerted by state legislatures. And of course, at the time of the Confederation, when the Articles of Confederation was drafted, with John Dickinson as the chair of the committee that drafted them. The idea was that power in a republic needed to be on the state level. But more specifically, power in a Republican form of government had to be in the people's branch of state government. In other words, the legislative branch within each state needed to be supreme. And the idea was that Republican government could only work when power was as potentially close to the people as possible. So therefore, by locating power in the legislative branch of government at the state level, the thinking behind the Confederation was that power would be close to the people. And legislative power, the ability of the people to interact and influence government, was the basic operative premise of Republican government. Consequently, power had to be there. That is really what these amendments that are being proposed today are all about. Clearly, in Mark Levin's Liberty Amendments, one of them is a balanced budget amendment. What is it that makes the balanced budget amendment so attractive? Why does it seem to be getting most of the attention rather than the rest of the amendments proposed by Mark Levin and by those who agree with his thinking? Obviously, the answer to that question is that a balanced budget amendment is extremely popular. It's not only popular among conservatives, among Republicans, many Democrats support a balanced budget amendment as well, because the arguments in favor of requiring the federal government to operate according to the balanced principles on which states operate and which individual families operate, which is based on the idea that you need to live within your income. That's a very popular idea, a very popular concept. There are very, very few people in the country who will take issue with that. So consequently, the best way to get the second convention called is to base it on that one amendment, because that way you're minimizing opposition. There's opposition to many of these other amendments, but there's less opposition to the balanced budget amendment than any of the others. So it stands to reason that that's the one that would get the attention. That's the one that all the focus would be based upon in the drive for a convention under Article 5 of the Constitution. And I think we've been through more than sufficient number of times the ingredients of the details of Article 5, the fact that you can amend the Constitution in either of two ways. You can propose the amendment in two ways. Either an amendment can be proposed by conventions in 2/3 of the states or by 2/3 of both houses of Congress. And in order to get the amendment approved or ratified, connected or adopted as part of the Constitution, you need to have 3/4 of the states approve it. I can remember in basic 101 government classes, that's the issue that those government classes used to focus on. In other words, they would have us learn the details. The questions on our exams would be explain that, what are the two ways that an amendment can be proposed? What are the two ways that an amendment can be approved? And we had to memorize that stuff and put it down on exams. But the fact of the matter is, none of us ever understood why there were two methods, why there were two methodologies or strategies proposed. Why did Article 5 contain two different ways on amendments? What was the difference? Why did it matter? Were the two different? Was it 6 or 1/2 dozen the other? Was one strategy or one method of amendment as good as the other, or was one better than the other, or whatever? And if one was better, why was it better? Obviously, we had classes taught by people who didn't know the answers to those questions. And the only way to secure answers to those questions is to go back into the period and understand the thinking at the time by the people who did it. And that's the framers, that's the founders. What did they think about amending the Constitution? The fact of the matter is, most people's understanding of the way that this federal government under the Constitution was structured and designed to operate continued to be a mystery, even to people who took courses in it. Successful completion of those courses, for the most part, depended upon memorization, not understanding. I know that was true in my case. And I minored in political science as an undergraduate. I minored in government. I took specific courses on the legislature, a whole semester course on Congress, a whole semester course on the presidency, a whole semester course on the Supreme Court. The traditional idea of an introductory government class for students in our school systems was, how does a bill become a law? What do you have to do? What's the mechanism? What's the procedure? But the fact of the matter is, even if you knew the procedure, you didn't understand why that procedure was that procedure. In other words, what is there about procedure? There was no recognition, for example, that the procedure directly affects outcome. And if you want a particular outcome, then your chances of getting it are better if you go one direction rather than the other. Or the other side of that coin is, if you don't want a particular outcome, then the only way to avoid it is to make sure that the process you adopt for promoting it, for introducing it and getting it through, is a particular one. But that kind of depth, that kind of understanding was missing. It wasn't there. To be very honest with you, if you listen to the debates about Common Core and listen to the issues surrounding the development of our AP exams in American history and American government, it's pretty obvious that that depth and that understanding still isn't there. And there are a lot of people in opposing the Common Core who are fighting like crazy to make sure it never is there. There's absolutely no question then that those who are pushing a second convention under Article 5 and using the balanced budget amendment as the instrument for getting that change, that call for an Article 5 convention through state legislatures, are doing so based on the fact that the vast majority of people don't know what's happening. They don't know, and I've talked to a number of friends and acquaintances about this issue in the last 6 or 7 months, because it's a big issue. It's been a big issue since we spent so much time on it here at the Virtual Center some months ago. And seriously, when I go to parties or I go out and have a few beers with folks or whatever, just in the course of conversation, I'll bring up the issue of a second convention, and most people look at you like they don't even know what you're talking about. When we did Mark Levin's book on the Liberty Amendments here at the Virtual Center, I took that material that we developed here, and I made a 20-minute proposal or presentation to our local Rotary Club here in Beckley. This was probably a year and a half ago. And I presented to the Rotary Club. And the room was in dead silence. People were looking at me like I had two heads. And these are business leaders in this community, bankers, and the mayor at that time was a member of the club. And members of the county commission and members and directors of various state agencies and municipal agencies and police department and the local the Boy Scouts and many other prominent groups were members of that audience. And the response I got was not specific questions about Mark Levin's book or about the specific amendments. It was the idea, what's this second convention about? I don't even know what you're talking about. And so basically, in that short period of time, we had to go back to basic 101 stuff. Information that most citizens, we presume, have, but in reality, we know that most don't. Based on that presentation, a member of the club who happens to be a founding member of a group of retired folks in one of our gated communities here in the region, informed me the following week after that presentation that at the book club that he and the members of his group had adopted Mark Levin's book for the selection of the book for the month. They wanted to read that book. And then they wanted to get together and have a discussion on it, and they asked me if I would lead the discussion. So about a year ago, and it was just about a year ago, it was last spring, I went out and had the most enlightening discussion with about 18, 19 folks that had read the book, Mark Levin's book. And it was very clear from the tone of the questions and the comments and stuff that I would say 2/3 of that group clearly was in favor of the Levin amendments, of the so-called Liberty amendments. That for the most part, they had questions about specific ones. But for the most part, they really agreed that doing something to rein in the federal government and get control over the federal debt and all the rest of it was a good thing. And we had a 2.5-hour meeting. But one of the things that I learned from that discussion, which was much more intensive and much more penetrating than was the Rotary presentation, which was much shorter, one of the things that I took from that presentation was a reality that even the people that felt most strongly and were most adamant in support of the idea of amending the Constitution, especially with a balanced budget amendment, really didn't understand the nature of ratification, the implications of what calling a second convention would be about. They were totally unaware that the people who framed the Constitution, James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, Tench Coxe of Philadelphia, for example, prominent businessman and financial guru in Pennsylvania politics, many of the other prominent leaders of the country who really marshaled the Constitution of the United States through the Constitutional Convention. Many of those folks were totally opposed to a second convention. In fact, their whole idea was, and they took their marching orders from Benjamin Franklin, whose very, very famous speech closed the Constitutional Convention on the 17th of September, 1787. Benjamin Franklin urged the delegates to go home to their states and get the Constitution ratified. And his argument was, it's not perfect. None of us, every one of us knows it's not perfect. Every one of us in this room, Franklin said, would change something in it. But his advice is, forget the changes you would make and go back to your states and paint this thing as the best we can get. And get it through. There's an amendment procedure in there. If it doesn't work in certain areas, we can fix it later. But the most important thing is not to focus on the flaws, on the negatives, but focus on the positives. And Franklin's strategy was based on the idea, if we don't adopt this system, this republic will not survive under the Articles of Confederation. Literally, the survival of the nation is on the table here. We have got to get this through. So in order to do that, put aside your concerns, put aside your druthers, put aside the areas that you would change or that you wish were different. Concentrate on what it is that people were able to agree on and compromise on. Get it through with the idea we can fix it later. We can find out what works and what doesn't work once we try it. But his argument is, if we allow the discussion to descend into a debate over the issues that we would change in the system, we will never get the system through. It stands to reason that the very same logic that Franklin was espousing for getting the Constitution through made sense to the people who were committed to the idea of making sure that the Constitution didn't get through. It stands to reason that those most opposed to the Constitution, which we have labeled anti-federalists, as if they were all in one organized group. They weren't. The only thing that united them all was opposition to ratification of the Constitution without change. And some of our most prominent and positive leaders that we label and lump under the idea of under the heading of our founders: George Mason, Patrick Henry, Samuel Adams, Richard Henry Lee, Samuel Chase, who becomes a member of the Supreme Court, and on and on and on. Very prominent people oppose ratification of the Constitution without amendment. And they were quick to realize that Franklin was speaking truth. The only way to get the Constitution through is to basically not focus on the negatives, but focus on the positives, and basically lay out the case is that this is the best we can get. Let's adopt this and fix it later if it needs fixing. That logic made perfect sense to the leaders of the opposition. What Franklin had done in it unwittingly, inadvertently, is give opponents to the Constitution a way to sabotage it, a way to defeat it. And that way was to focus on the negatives. Focus on what the Constitution didn't have and didn't do. And demand that those changes be made before the Constitution is adopted, not after. And that led all of the attention to focus on the lack of a Bill of Rights. The leading opponent at the Constitutional Convention of a Bill of Rights was James Madison. He was the author of the Virginia Plan. He didn't believe that protection of individual rights was necessary under the Constitution because many citizens, most citizens, lived in states that had bills of rights in their state constitutions. And Madison's thinking was, the Constitution that I've drafted, the Virginia Plan, was not in any way intended to take away anybody's rights. Their right to free speech, their right to religious freedom, their right to a free press, their right to assemble, their right to a jury trial, the right to bear arms, etc., etc., etc. That's not what the Constitution of the United States is at all was about. says James Madison, the person who drafted it. So therefore, why do we need to redirect people's attention away from the real issues? The real issues were to get control of the runaway policies and procedures happening within our states. And the only way to do that is to shift some of the key powers from the state level to the federal level. And that way you remove those issues from the ability of the people to tamper with them, by taking away the authority of state legislatures to adopt any kind of legislation in those areas. In other words, paper money. Many of the 7 states during the Confederation period had printed paper money in order that people could meet obligations in debts and tax payments and various other things. So the basic thinking was that if you include in the Constitution a provision denying anybody, the states, any opportunity to print paper money, and giving that power exclusively to the federal government, then you immediately make it impossible for state legislatures to interfere with contracts and private debts and private obligations and all of the things that Madison especially believed would sink the Confederation. That was the purpose for the Constitutional Convention, Madison believed, one of the major ones. And according to Madison, that's what the Constitution was about. The Constitution was about readjusting the balance of power between the states and the new federal government that the Constitution created. It had nothing to do with individual rights and liberties. It wasn't that Madison wanted to interfere with them or infringe upon them or anything else. He didn't. He was the architect of the bill in Virginia for religious freedom. He wasn't opposed to individual freedom. In Federalist Number 10, he basically advocated the idea of individual freedom, liberty. In fact, his basic point is in Federalist Number 10, to tamper with liberty, because liberty leads to factions, is to find a cure for the disease that's worse than the disease itself. Madison was not an opponent of freedoms, of individual freedom at all, of liberty. He was an advocate of it. The Constitution of the United States that he developed was in principle designed to protect individual freedom, individual liberty. So that wasn't the issue at all. Consequently, Madison did not feel the need for the Constitution to get into a reaffirmation of these liberties, which people had took for granted, that people had used as justification for independence from England, that people had written into their state constitutions. In other words, the states, when they adopted constitutions with independence, had written into their state constitutions protection against many of the infringements on individual freedom that the British had undertaken prior to 1776. Madison accepted those. He didn't feel that the Constitution ought to get into those areas at all. So consequently, Madison became the most outspoken opponent of the need for a Bill of Rights. But the opponents of the Constitution quickly recognized that the absence of a Bill of Rights was their best argument against the Constitution. In other words, if the Anti-Federalist thinking was, if Madison and the other Federalists don't believe that it's necessary, then give it to us anyway, humor us. And of course there were very prominent people who believed, and they were not political operatives per se. They were sincere people. One of them, George Mason. George Mason refused to sign the Constitution of the United States because it didn't have a Bill of Rights. He believed it was absolutely essential that it have one. And he became a major spokesman for a Bill of Rights. Patrick Henry was probably the most dynamic, outspoken opponent of the Constitution in Virginia, in the Virginia Ratifying Convention. The difference between George Mason and Patrick Henry, however, was that Patrick Henry was a politician. Patrick Henry was using the issue to defeat the Constitution. George Mason, seemingly, was pointing to that issue because he felt that adding a Bill of Rights would strengthen the Constitution. So I think their strategies were pointed in different directions, as it were. But the fact that Patrick Henry jumped on board with Mason and began to push the absence of a Bill of Rights as a reason for Virginia to not ratify the Constitution seems to me an indication of what a valuable weapon the absence of a Bill of Rights was to the Anti-Federalists. The lack of it became more embarrassing to the Federalists than they would have experienced if they had included it. So consequently, Madison himself was forced to switch and to go from the most outspoken opponent of a Bill of Rights to the nation's most outspoken advocate for a Bill of Rights. The reason? Because Madison realized that the only way to pull the rug out from under the opponents of the Constitution was to grant amendments protecting individual liberties, because the absence of those was becoming too hard to justify. It was building momentum among opponents of the Constitution, and the only way to derail that movement against the Constitution was to concede amendments, was to concede a Bill of Rights. And in the first Congress, Madison became the most outspoken proponent of a Bill of Rights. Literally by himself, he marshaled the Bill of Rights through the first Congress, even when there were many people in the first Congress who believed that it wasn't necessary. Now that we got the Constitution, forget it, Jimmy. Don't worry about rights anymore. Madison's argument is, until we put amendments into the Constitution, we will not satisfy opposition to it. The only way to reverse the growing opposition to the Constitution of the United States is to grant people's concerns about protection of individual liberties. So let's do it. However, the issue, more than anything else, that caused Madison to shift from an opponent of a Bill of Rights to a proponent of a Bill of Rights was the threat of a second constitutional convention. It is not an overstatement to say that when New York, in the summer of 1788, ratified the Constitution, but included with its ratification a letter to all the other states requesting the selection of delegates to attend a second convention in order to consider amendments, Madison was horrified. When Virginia signed on to that letter and New York and Virginia in late 1788 became drivers for a second convention, Madison was frightened to death because Madison knew that there was nothing that would derail the Constitution of the United States than a second convention. Because the second convention would put the Constitution of the United States back on the table and give people an opportunity to vote against things that their representatives at the Constitutional Convention had been able to negotiate and compromise. Madison recognized that everything the Constitutional Convention had gained with the drafting of the Constitution would potentially be lost if a second convention were ever convened. So consequently, Madison became an outspoken champion for a Bill of Rights. That was the only way to derail the movement towards a second convention. And in our program last Wednesday, we looked at a couple of letters that James Madison had written in late 1788, in which he explained, I think rather clearly, as to why we did not want a second constitutional convention. In the first, which is the most informative letter, it is a letter written to George Lee Tuberville, who was a member of the Virginia legislature. It is dated November 2nd, 1788. And in that letter, Madison addresses his remarks exclusively to the issue of why he is opposed to a second convention. I'm not going into the entire letter. I'm just reading one paragraph of it. Madison said, quote, if a general convention were to take place for the avowed and sole purpose of revising the Constitution, it would naturally consider itself as having a greater latitude than the Congress. An election into it would be courted by the most violent partisans on both sides, and would no doubt contain individuals of insidious views, who, under the mask of seeking alterations popular in some parts, might have the dangerous opportunity of sapping the very foundations of the fabric itself. Madison recognized that a constitutional convention would give a forum, provide an opportunity to the true ideological opponents of the Constitution, those who were out to destroy it. It would give them an audience, give them a vehicle, and that what they would be able to do would be to propose changes to the Constitution which seemed to be good ones, but in reality would weaken the entire structure of the federal government itself, which was their ultimate objective. What Madison was implying here is that certain people would use change, which they argued would be positive, as a way to destroy this republic. There's absolutely no question that that's what we are facing today with this movement toward a second convention. I have to ask you the most obvious question. As you think on this issue, I encourage you, I beg you to think on this. If the call for a second convention under Article 5 to approve a balanced budget amendment was going to restrict itself and be limited to only that one issue, why are Mark Levin and the others talking about 8 to 10 other amendments that we ought to adopt while we're at it in order to create this union as the founders really wanted it, which was state control, popular control, power in the legislatures? In other words, a return to the realities of the Confederation in the 1780s. If the issue was a balanced budget amendment, rather than emasculating the Constitution of the United States, then why aren't the proponents of a second convention focusing on the need for a balanced budget amendment only? Why are they talking about the powers of the Supreme Court? Why are they talking about overturning senators, overturning congressional decisions? Why are they talking about these kinds of things? Why are they talking about including a declaration that this nation is a Christian nation? Why are they talking about tampering with things that have nothing to do directly with the balanced budget amendment? Recognizing, of course, that the balanced budget amendment in and of itself, I believe, would constitute the destruction of this republic alone. I don't want the second convention, even if it is restricted to the balanced budget amendment, because the balanced budget amendment would destroy this nation because it would deny the federal government the opportunity to govern in the public interest. It would basically make the priorities in this nation the budget, not service to the citizens of this nation. It would make it impossible for government to govern in accordance with the public interest, which is what the Constitution of the United States is all about if you take the preamble seriously. To promote the public interest, to promote the general welfare. That's what government's job is. To limit it to operating within a budget set by those who are ideologically committed to the undoing of many of the current programs and policies of that federal government, is the equivalent of, quote, starving the beast, unquote, which is what Grover Norquist, the head of the group called Americans for Tax Reform, has been advocating for years. The way you get the federal government under control and out of the business of governing for the public interest, the way you get that is to deny the government the funds to do anything else. Force government to cut programs until it gets within a budget which we control. That's the issue. How do you do that? The way you do it is at a constitutional convention which would effectively open up the entire Constitution to reconsideration. It would return power to state legislatures as existed under the Articles of Confederation, with one major difference. And I think we're moving rapidly towards it's 54 minutes after the hour. We've got about 5 minutes left in this first hour before we pause for a break. I think this is the issue that probably would best constitute the conclusion of this, our first hour. And that is the major difference between amending the Constitution now in accordance with bringing power back to the states, specifically to state legislatures, as was in the original Constitution of the United States, if you will, which was the Articles of Confederation. The difference between then and now is not in where power is, but rather who controls it. This will be the brunt, I think, of our second hour. And I think this conclusion, this issue, concluding our first hour and leading into the second, is probably a good way to go. And that revolves around what is the difference between a constitutional convention that would meet now with a goal towards returning power to state legislatures and the calling of a constitutional convention in a second convention in 1788 to consider amendments to the Constitution. The difference between the two is not where power will be located. Rather, it revolves around who has that power, who exercises that power. Let's go back. Madison believed that the reason you needed the Constitution of the United States was because control of key issues, powers, being located within the legislative branch of state governments made government too unstable, too insecure, because putting power in the legislative branch made it too susceptible to pressures of organized majority, pressures of organized groups, specifically the danger of the majority faction. If the majority of the people were able to get together, I'll give you some examples of this in the second hour, and demand legislation from their legislature to meet their needs, then that created instability in government. So Madison's thinking was the reason we needed a Constitution of the United States was in order to stabilize a government that was too unstable and too insecure, because power was being exercised within state legislatures by organized groups, factions, predominantly in the 1780s, the poor. Legislatures were too susceptible to majority pressure. They were too likely to respond to it by passing the kinds of laws which were detrimental to stability and insecurity, detrimental to property owners, detrimental to creditors. And thereby they were jeopardizing the credibility and the security of the United States itself. Therefore, Madison believed you had to move this power to the federal level. That would create a situation which would make it impossible, he believed, for organized majorities to put direct pressure on the legislative branch of government in order to get what they want. I apologize for the phone in the background. What's the difference today? What's the difference in today's world about the calling of an Article 5 convention ostensibly to approve a balanced budget amendment? What has changed? The difference is that more than half of our state legislatures today are under the control of organized interest groups included within a so-called nonpartisan 501c3 group called the American Legislative Exchange, the American Legislative Exchange Council, ALEC. What am I saying? What I am saying that when these calls for a second convention focus on returning power to the state legislatures, ALEC in its model legislation is talking about a return of power to legislatures that they control. In other words, the American Legislative Exchange Council adopted a strategy since it was created, and we'll get into this next hour, in 1973. Its strategy is the best way to take over control of the many is to secure control of the few. By taking control of state legislatures, by states, one by one, and getting them to sign on to legislation that this group itself drafts, then what you effectively do is take over control of the republic. You are doing it in a way, the only thing left, once you get control of the state legislatures, now you got to get the power that the Constitution put at the federal level back into those state legislatures. And this second convention is designed to do that. That's the point I would like to end this first hour on. That's the danger to the republic of the second convention. It will take power that the Constitution moved from the state level to the federal level. It would bring it back to the states. The difference is that these are states that now the people no longer control. ALEC does. And the interests that make up ALEC do. So what we need to do in our second hour today is take a more concentrated, focused look at ALEC. Who's in it? What's it about? How's it organized? What's its modus operandi? What's it trying to do, and how's it trying to do it? I really believe that we got an issue here that we have to promote. We have to identify, we have to take apart here at the Virtual Center. And we're committed to doing that. It is 2 minutes after the hour. We will pause for a 5-minute break here at the Virtual Center. I invite you to stay tuned and join us after a short break. I know Bob will fill that break with some really good music that he's selected. It gives us an opportunity to stand up and stretch and walk around and get a cup of coffee or go to the bathroom or whatever we need to do. I'll be honest with you, I need to do all of those things. So with that, let's take a 5-minute break. It is now 3 minutes after the hour. We'll get back together again in 4 or 5 minutes. This is Bill O'Brien. You're listening to the Virtual Center. Please stay with us. We'll be right back.
Dr. Bill, it's your first program since the vernal equinox, so I figured a little Appalachian spring was in order.
Oh, I loved it. I loved it. Oh, my God, I love Copeland. Thank you, Bob. Thank you.
My pleasure.
It was wonderful. Welcome back to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. The pressure's on for the second hour, because I'd like to believe there's no way we could top the first hour. There's no way we can top the musical interlude of Appalachian Spring. We can't top that. The pressure's on. It's kind of the same kind of pressure that the West Virginia is on for Thursday night when they're playing the University of Kentucky. It's probably going to be a smackdown, although the media folks on the sports talk shows are trying to tout it that the West Virginia plays a style of basketball that could give Kentucky trouble, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I guess what I'm saying is we could have a great program, great hour here. I don't know if we can top Appalachian Spring. I don't think so. I'm not even going to try. I'm willing to accept the beatdown because I can't top that. Thank you for staying with us. If you've been with us here since the beginning of our program 1 hour ago, I want to thank you for staying with us here at the Virtual Center. If you are just joining us, I want to thank you. I want to welcome you. We are into the issue of a second convention, the pressure, the move push or growing snowball, if you will, in favor of the convening of an Article 5 convention under Article 5 of the Constitution for purposes of considering a balanced budget amendment as part of the Constitution of the United States. We spent our first hour going into this, in the background of this. We looked specifically at the founders. We looked at Madison. We looked at Madison's fear, horror at the thought of a second convention. It seems to me that's enough. We need to pursue this issue a little bit more. This is very, very serious. I doubt whether we'll be able to get all of this on the table today by any stretch. I'm guessing that our program tomorrow, which I remind you will be an hour and a half program, will begin 1/2 hour later. We'll begin at 1:30 Eastern Time. Will be a 90-minute program, and I think a good portion of that will have to be committed to this issue as well. I also remind you, as we did at the outset of our first hour today, that we will not be doing a live program on Wednesday this week. We will have a repeat program here on the Head On Radio Network. I have an obligation which will take us into program time on Wednesday, and so we'll be going into our library of archived programs in the White Rose Society for Wednesday's program. I invite you to participate actively in our program. I'd love to hear from you on this issue because I think it's that important. It dawned on me during the break that last Wednesday, if you recall, we had a call from Horst from Taiwan. And Horst and Bob Kincaid and I spent quite a bit of time on this issue. We were more or less dealing with it in a general way on the whole issue of a call for the convention, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It was a wonderful conversation. In fact, one of the people that I heard from on the program said that they felt it was one of the best programs that we had, and part of it is because we did engage in conversation. We had somebody who called, and we basically went around and around, and of course Bob's always there, willing and able, not just willing but able, to chime in and make a substantial contribution to these discussions as well. Bob's background, as many of you who have been longtime fans of the Head On Radio Network know, Bob's background and his command of issues is incredible, and he contributes so much. And we would love to hear from you. We would love to have you share with our listeners some of your thoughts and your concerns on this movement, as Horst did last Wednesday. This is a conversation. It is a continuing conversation on the founders and the foundations of this union. There's no better way to understand it than to talk about it and exchange ideas and thoughts about it, and we look forward to hearing you from that. Our phone number is area code 304-663-4676. 663-4676. Horn, H-O-R-N. So 304-663-HORN will get you into our studios and on the air here at the Virtual Center. My email address, if you'd like to communicate directly with me one-on-one, is waobrien906@gmail.com. That's waobrien, O-B-R-I-E-N, 906. I keep emphasizing that because so many people spell O'Brien I-A-N. My name is spelled I-E-N, 906@gmail.com. We were talking, for those of you who have been with us, and let me reiterate very quickly for those who are just joining us, we were talking about the push for a second convention, and we ended the hour with the difference by looking at, Madison, in 1788, Madison was horrified at the thought of a second convention, and more than anything else, it was that convinced him that we better have a Bill of Rights. We better able to convince people that the Constitution will indeed adopt the Bill of Rights, or the people will be given the opportunity to adopt the Bill of Rights, because Madison realized that there was no quicker way and more effective way to undercut or to derail the enthusiasm for a second convention than by giving people protection of individual rights, which is what they were about. But Madison knew that some of the people who were pushing hardest for a Bill of Rights weren't concerned about liberties, individual liberties at all. Their priority was to make the kinds of changes in the structure of government which would effectively undercut the Constitution of the United States and undo many of the changes that the Constitution of the United States would make in the governing of this nation, in the effectiveness of this republic. So again, you had the real hardcore proponents for undercutting the Constitution of the United States, covering their efforts or justifying or portraying their efforts as efforts to amend the Constitution in order to protect individual freedoms. Madison knew that a lot of the people that were signing on did it for that reason. But he also recognized that some of the people who were behind this effort really weren't concerned about individual rights at all. Their principal concern was to destroy the Constitution of the United States and the changes that it would make. Madison said that in the quote that we looked at. No doubt, those who would make themselves available for participation in a second convention, Madison said, would no doubt contain individuals of insidious views who, under the mask of seeking alterations popular in some parts, might have the dangerous opportunity of sapping the very foundations of the fabric. That's exactly what we're talking about in this contemporary, current move to call an Article 5 convention, ostensibly to consider a balanced budget amendment. Many of the people who are behind this push for the second convention are not so much interested in the balanced budget amendment as they are in controlling the government of the United States, in undoing the very nature of this republic. That's their strategy. That's their goal, their objective. Their strategy, or the way they choose to do that, is to use the popular appeal of the idea of a balanced budget amendment as an excuse for convening a second convention. Once they do that, there's no way to limit the convention to the balanced budget amendment alone. Although, as I mentioned earlier, I believe that in itself would sink this republic. But that's a debate for another day. That's another issue. And the group that we've been talking about that's really orchestrating this whole push, this whole move, is this group called the American Legislative Exchange Council, ALEC. I've been doing a lot of reading about ALEC, not only in preparation for last week's programs, but in intervening time between last Wednesday and today's program. And I'm learning a lot of things about ALEC that I didn't know. I knew a little bit about it. But the fact of the matter is, not a whole lot of people even know about ALEC at all. Or if they do know about it, they're like me, and they know little dribs and drabs and pieces here and there. But they really don't have the full picture of what ALEC is about. ALEC has been operating in the shadows, so to speak. I don't know how else to say this. A friend of mine, I sent an article that I have written on this issue to a friend of mine for his reaction, and his basic point was that ALEC has been operating by moonlight because their strategy is to take over, is to get control of the many by taking over control of the few, a piece at a time. And that's exactly what's happening. The group has been rather invisible by design. The American Legislative Council, and I've gotten a lot of this off the research that I've done recently, and I invite many of you to go to ALEC.org ALEC.org, which is their organization, their website, ALEC.org, or look for the other side of the coin, so to speak. Look at ALEC Exposed, because ALEC has pretty much been operating under the radar since its creation, if you can believe this, in 1973. So this is not a new organization. There's no question in my mind. In fact, this was suggested in a special focused on ALEC some years ago by Bill Moyers, that ALEC as an organization was created in response to the Powell Memorandum of the early 1970s. Many of you will remember that we devoted a couple of programs here at the Virtual Center to the Powell Amendment, authored, obviously, by former Supreme Court Justice Lewis Powell of Virginia, Richmond, Virginia. Lewis Powell issued his memorandum, which has been called the Powell Memorandum, in a letter to the United States Chamber of Commerce. And his basic point in it was that corporate America, big business in this country, had to begin to take seriously the attacks on capitalism and free enterprise coming principally from our campuses. And that big business had to respond in kind. That big business had to marshal its money and its forces, identify its targets, and go about the business of responding to criticism and defending free enterprise capitalism. And one of the outcomes of that initiative, of that memorandum, was the creation of the American Legislative Exchange Council. It wasn't called that at first. It was called something a little bit more pointed at that time. Which had the word conservative in it. I can't remember the exact name. I read over it. But by the mere inclusion of the word conservative, it looked a little bit political. And so the name was changed to the American Legislative Exchange Council. And basically, its mission was reconstituted in such a way that it defined itself as a nonpartisan group. It applied for and received 501c3 funding under the IRS. In other words, this group does not pay taxes. It is allowed to operate tax-free by portraying itself as nonpartisan, as a nonpartisan effort to improve the business climate in this country for all of its citizens. In other words, ALEC was able to portray itself as an organization operating in the public interest. Consequently, it was granted tax-free status by the Internal Revenue Service. In 2011, opponents of ALEC were successful in raising serious questions about ALEC's nonpartisanship, and actually challenged in court its right to tax-free status, to 501c3 status. At that point in 2011, ALEC was forced to change its position and the way it operated in order to retain its image of nonpartisanship. But let me share some of the details of ALEC's operation and organization. ALEC is comprised of individual state legislators, members of state legislatures who pay dues, who pay a membership fee of $50 a year, $100 on every 2 years. And ALEC claims a membership of around 2,000 individual members. Obviously, ALEC's budget is much greater than that provided by 2,000 people paying $50 a year memberships. Because ALEC also has corporate members. And corporations pay membership fees of anywhere from $7,000 a year to $25,000 a year, depending on the role, the active role that that particular organization seeks to play in ALEC's operation. ALEC has a number of committees formed to draft model legislation. The idea is that ALEC will bring together people interested in particular issues. They will draft model legislation and send it back to the states for approval be run through state legislatures and approved by those legislatures. There's absolutely no question that the bulk of ALEC's funding comes from its corporate membership. However, in order to maintain its 501c3 tax status, ALEC must constantly emphasize and make the point that it's its individual members that make policy, not its corporate members. In 2011, Common Cause and other liberal groups challenged the 501c3 status in court and raised serious issues. Not only that, but an awful lot of the internal operations and functioning of ALEC were made public in a website called ALEC Exposed. And some of the details of who belonged to the group, who funded the group, how much funding it had, what it was designed to do, and some of its strategic goals were laid bare for all to see in 2011. I invite you to go on your computer, on your search engine, to ALEC Exposed, and you will be witness to some of the details of ALEC, who belongs to it, how much they pay, etc. Let me share with you just some of these details. I don't have them all. This is not necessarily I don't mean to focus exclusively on ALEC. What I am focusing on is the extent to which ALEC is behind this movement for a second convention. And obviously, West Virginia, a week ago Saturday night, became the 27th state of the required 34 for the calling of a constitutional convention. So ALEC's role in this is significant. As of 2011, and I'm getting this from information straight off, and some of this is on Wikipedia, by the way, and of course a lot of people have serious doubts about Wikipedia, because obviously anybody is free to change the details on Wikipedia. But if you accept the fact that the bulk of this information is valid, then I think it's significant information. As of 2011, corporation, think tank, and trade group members accounted for almost 99% of ALEC's $7 million budget. So it's very obvious that the members paying $50 a year is rather a drop in the bucket in ALEC's overall operating funds, which exceed $7 million a year. 99% of that budget comes from corporate members, think tank members, and trade group associations. Legislators pay $50 a year for membership. Non-legislators pay anywhere from $7,000 to $25,000 and more to participate in the various task forces that ALEC creates on specific issues. In 2010, NPR, National Public Radio, reported that tax records showed that corporations had collectively paid $6 million a year to ALEC. Its total revenue in 2011 was $9 million. In 2010, ALEC received $100,000 each from AT&T, Allergan, R.J. Reynolds Tobacco, in order that they be named to presidential level sponsors for ALEC's annual meeting. Obviously, $100,000 was the cost to hold a position in ALEC at the presidential level. 11 other members, including Pfizer, the Institute for Legal Reform, paid $50,000 a year to be named to the chairman level in ALEC's fundraising efforts. In addition to Pfizer and the Institute for Legal Reform, Blue Cross Blue Shield, BP America were also $50,000 chairman-level member sponsors. Koch Industries was one of 14 vice chairman-level sponsors in ALEC's 2010 annual meeting. Vice chairman-level membership required a $25,000 donation. According to tax records, Charles Koch Charitable Foundation gave $75,858 to ALEC in 2009. According to Greenpeace, ALEC has received $525,858 from Koch foundations I've misplaced the rest of my data here. I hope you will bear with me for a moment. Excuse me, let me go back because I've got my second page of data here and I had misplaced it. ALEC received $525,858 from Koch Foundation from 2005 to 2011. According to the Center for Public Integrity, ALEC received $150,000 from Charles and David Koch in 2011. ExxonMobil's foundation donated $30,000 to ALEC in both 2005 and 2006. Exxon, in August of 2011, Exxon paid $45,000 to sponsor a workshop on natural gas at the ALEC convention in San Diego. Exxon, $45,000 for a workshop at a convention on natural gas. What does that tell you about the issue of energy? According to a December 2013 article in The Guardian, ALEC faced a funding shortfall in 2013 after losing more than a third of its projected income. 400 state legislators had dropped out of the group, along with more than 60 corporate donors. The group's 2013 income actually dropped from $8.4 million to $7.3 million in 2013, a 15% decrease. Many prominent members of ALEC over the last couple of years have become disenchanted and a little bit concerned with what ALEC is doing and some of the positions it is taking. I think we can get a sense of the influence of this group by looking at some of the organizations that have withdrawn from ALEC membership of late. More than 60 corporations and foundations, including Coca-Cola, Wendy's, Kraft Foods, McDonald's, Amazon, General Electric, Apple, Procter & Gamble, Walmart, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, Blue Cross and Blue Shield, all dropped support for ALEC or let their memberships lapse in 2013. Much of this was in response to the negative publicity that ALEC received during the Trayvon Martin situation, because one of the model pieces of legislation that ALEC was instrumental in developing was the Stand Your Ground legislation that Florida adopted, which became so much a matter of public attention in the shooting, the murder of Trayvon Martin. ALEC suffered in membership as a result of the negative publicity associated with opposition to that kind of legislation. One of the groups that withdrew, and there were others, in late 2014, Google, Microsoft, Facebook, eBay, and Yahoo all announced that they were ending their ties to ALEC. Multiple companies focused on environmental concerns as their reason for opposing ALEC. A prominent group of corporate members in ALEC are coal companies, Peabody Coal, and others. I think what we're seeing here, if you look just at the corporations that were members of ALEC and left ALEC in the last couple of years, you can begin to get a sense as to why the status, their 501c3 status, was in question. Look at the membership. Look at the money that was going into the drafting of this legislation for distribution throughout the country through state legislatures. So obviously, its nonpartisan status was being seriously questioned. ALEC is instrumental in the movement for this Article 5 convention to amend the Constitution of the United States. I mentioned last Wednesday, and I wanted to share with you again because I happened to come across a copy of this on ALEC's website. If you look at alex.org on its website, you will find examples of the model legislation that ALEC was instrumental in drafting. One of the pieces of legislation that it was instrumental in drafting drew my attention because I wrote an article on it and had it published in our Gazette, in the Charleston Gazette here in West Virginia some weeks ago. The West Virginia legislature, during its session, in fact, rather early in its session, adopted legislation related to our K through 12 educational system, requiring 18 months of grounding in American history before West Virginia K through 12 students were allowed to take courses in economics, in world politics, in global problems, in environmental issues, in anything related to the nature of socialism or anything else. In other words, the idea was that our West Virginia kids would be well grounded and well poised in free enterprise capitalism and a very, very slanted, mind-numbing look at American history before they were allowed to encounter some of these more controversial topics. I wrote an op-ed piece in the Charleston Gazette criticizing the West Virginia legislature for its adoption of that particular legislation. At that time, I did not know that the origin of that legislation, along with the Constitutional Convention issue and a number of others, was coming from ALEC. But in going through the ALEC website, I came across a model piece of legislation which ALEC developed and distributed to various state legislatures, one of them obviously being West Virginia, on a course, and I'm going to focus on this if you don't mind, entitled The Founding Philosophy and Principles Act. In other words, what ALEC was recommending to state legislatures is that they adopt their own version of something ALEC called the Founding Philosophy and Principles Act. Let me share with you the ingredients of this legislation. Here's a summary of it. This is what ALEC recommends that state legislatures pass in their states related to their public schools. The West Virginia House of Delegates passed this legislation. Quote, whereas the survival of the Republic requires that our nation's children, the future guardians of its heritage and participants in its governance, have a clear understanding of the founding philosophy and the founding principles of our government for a free people, which are found in the Declaration of Independence, the United States Constitution, the Federalist Papers, and the writings of the founders, and an understanding of their preservation. Now, therefore, the General Assembly of blank, insert the name of your state, enacts this model legislation. Section 1. The act shall be known as the Founding Philosophy and Principles Act. Section 2. On civil literacy. A. Local boards of education shall require during the high school years the teaching of a semester course that focuses on the following. In West Virginia, that semester course became 18 months. A course that focuses on the following. 1. America's founding philosophy to include at least the following. First, the Creator endowed inalienable rights of the people. Let me go back and reiterate that. This course, developed by ALEC and distributed to state legislatures throughout the country, is proposing the adoption in the states of a Founding Philosophy and Principles Act, which will require at least a one-semester course that includes at least the following. The Creator endowed inalienable rights of the people. Second, the purpose of government is to protect the unalienable rights of the people and to protect people from violence and fraud. Third, structure of government, separation of powers, checks and balances. This course must include at least those. Mention of the fact that the purpose of government under the Constitution is the protection of inalienable rights derived from the Creator. In other words, the Constitution of the United States was designed to protect the philosophy outlined in the Declaration of Independence 11 years earlier. There was no such thing as a Confederation period. There was no such thing as post-war recession. There was no such thing as the breakdown in government that Madison alluded to in his Vices of the American Political System as justification of the need for a constitutional change. All of that disappears in this course. In this course, the one paragraph that talks about inalienable rights from our Creator becomes the Constitution becomes the operative philosophy of this government, and the Constitution of the United States becomes the mechanism designed to institutionalize and promote it and create it. That's the mantra of conservative intellectuals, scholars in this country, who are engaged in heavy research, putting out books and articles to deny the realities of the Confederation period, more specifically, to deny the degree to which the Constitution of the United States is a response to the Confederation period. What they're interested in is in making the Constitution of the United States a direct response to that one paragraph of the Articles of Confederation. Totally ignoring, did I say Articles of Confederation? I meant Declaration of Independence. The one paragraph of the Declaration of Independence. Totally ignored is the fact that 85 to 90% of the Declaration of Independence focuses on the allegations against Great Britain. Also ignored in the shuffle is the fact that the Congress, which approved the Declaration of Independence, spent almost no time on that paragraph, but spent all of its debate and discussion time on the details of the charges and allegations against the mother country. In other words, to the people who drafted it and signed it, the Declaration of Independence had very little to do with the functioning and the foundation of this nation. That was encompassed within the commitment in all the states to the idea of republicanism, to the need for popular government, which produced the Articles of Confederation. All of that is ignored in this course. And yet this course is being portrayed as, quote, the Founding Philosophy and Principles Act. These are the founding philosophies and principles of ALEC, but they are not the founding principles of the founders. Let's go on with some of the other issues contained in this course. Besides this founding philosophy, which will include at least creator-endowed inalienable rights, the purpose of government is to protect those inalienable rights and to protect people from violence and fraud. And the third element of this founding philosophy is the structure of government, separation of powers, and checks and balances. So the mechanisms of operation in the Constitution, the modus operandi, if you will, the strategy of separation of powers and checks and balances included in Madison's Federalist Number 10 are seen as part of the founding philosophy of this nation and are to be taught to our young people as such. And they are. I mean, if you ask any kid walking the street, anybody walking the street, what the founding principles of our Constitution are, they'll say separation of powers and checks and balances. They don't know what the heck it means, but they'll say it anyway. A second ingredient of this issue is emphasis on the rule of law with frequent and free elections in a representative government. The people's role in government will strictly be defined as that of participation. America's founding principles are to include at least the following: federalism, government as close to the people as possible, power in the states. Second, Bill of Rights guaranteed freedoms of speech, press, religion, and peaceable assembly. Third, private property rights and freedoms of individual enterprise. Tell me that content of this model piece of legislation that theoretically will be adopted in state after state for high school students is not drafted by people with corporate interests or corporate priorities in mind. The idea that America's founding principles are to support the idea of private property rights and freedom of individual enterprise. You may remember that one of the dissenting opinions in a very famous Supreme Court case that we addressed here at the Virtual Center some months and months ago was the dissenting opinion of one Oliver Wendell Holmes, who basically argued that to include commitment to the idea of free enterprise within the founding principles of this nation is to insert an economic philosophy into the fundamental laws of this nation. Oliver Wendell Holmes argued this was absolutely disgraceful. It was unconscionable. It was wrong. That what you are doing is taking one of a number of economic philosophies and embedding it within the Constitution of the United States as if it was a part of fundamental law created by the people of the United States. It was not. It is the economic philosophical preference of corporate America. But under the aegis of ALEC and its influence over the kinds of legislation that's coming out of our state legislatures, these ingredients are becoming essential required parts of a course that state legislatures are adopting and demanding that our young people take. Again, I suggest to you that some of the major corporations over the last couple of years are withdrawing from ALEC. Here in West Virginia, dated just yesterday, March 22nd, in our state newspaper, the Charleston Gazette and Daily Mail, is an article, an op-ed by one Wendy McCuskey on right-to-work legislation in West Virginia. Wendy McCuskey is the state director of Americans for Prosperity, which is a group totally funded by the Koch Foundation, by the Koch brothers. This is one of the spin-off groups that Koch money has created, Americans for Prosperity. Its West Virginia director is Wendy McCuskey. And in yesterday's Gazette, Wendy McCuskey penned an op-ed piece on the value of right-to-work legislation and on the shame and mistake that the West Virginia legislature made in the session just concluded in not approving West Virginia as a right-to-work state, but in promising that Americans for Progress would be back at next year's West Virginia legislative session. In this article, that in this defense of right to work, which Wendy McCuskey writes, one of the things that I found interesting, and I counted them, was that she uses the word freedom 5 times. Right to work is all about individual freedom. The freedom to not have to pay dues to a union. Conclusion, right-to-work legislation portrays itself as being concerned with individual freedom, but its real objective is to destroy unions in this country. And in the very first paragraph of this article, Wendy McCuskey points out that when Wisconsin adopted right-to-work legislation, many of you saw the picture, the photograph of Governor Scott Walker signing right-to-work legislation in Wisconsin, which was drafted by ALEC. It marked, this is Wendy McCuskey's article, it marked a halfway point in the nation's fight for employee freedom. Fully 25 of America's 50 states now give employees the power to decide for themselves whether to join a union. That first sentence, that first paragraph, seems to me to say it all. One is that 25 of the 50 states have adopted the right-to-work legislation drafted by ALEC. West Virginia didn't. Almost did, but didn't. But the tone of this article suggests that it probably will at the next legislative session. But notice the way that this right-to-work effort is spun. I'm thinking obviously of Bill O'Reilly's no spin zone idea. This is the way that Wendy McCuskey spins the issue of right to work. We have reached the halfway point by getting 25 of the 50 states to adopt it. We have reached the halfway point in the nation's fight for employee freedom. No, we have reached the halfway point of ALEC's fight to destroy unions. That's what we need to see. That's what we need to focus on. That's what we need to concentrate our attention on. That's what's behind the call for a second constitutional convention, is the objectives of ALEC and its members. 99% of ALEC's $7 million plus budget comes from corporate members. I think it's relevant as to who these members are and were. Clearly, it's important that a number of major corporations have decided to bow out of ALEC for various reasons. But that does not for 1 second deny the purpose and the intent of this group and the legislation that it develops and designs. Among the defenses of right to work, and you can read this article for yourself, just go to wvgazette.com and look under opinion when you get the list of options on the home page. Just click opinion and you will get a list of the recent opinion pieces in the Charleston Gazette, and Wendy McCuskey's piece dated yesterday, March 22nd, is one of those pieces. Among the defenses that she uses to defend right to work in West Virginia, she says, quote, "It's also critical for increasing West Virginians' income. Research from the American Legislative Exchange Council," there it is. Research from the American Legislative Exchange Council shows that right-to-work states enjoy 12% faster income growth than non-right-to-work states. The Mackinac Center for Public Policy, meanwhile, shows that right-to-work states have a 4.1% higher per capita income than other states. 2 quick points and then we'll leave because we're at 59 minutes after the hour. We got to move out of here in order to create room for the next program here on Head On. 12% faster income growth than non-right-to-work states. That probably has something to do with the decline in salaries that are going to happen once a state adopts right-to-work. You go way back to the beginning, to the base, and then you start to grow salaries all over again without the power of unions to negotiate for them. And secondly, right-to-work states have a 4.1% higher per capita income. That's probably because of the degree to which corporate interests and companies themselves tend to migrate to right-to-work states. They bring those heavy salaries with them. With that, we'll sign off here at the Virtual Center. This is Bill O'Brien thanking you for joining us today. Thank you. We'll be back tomorrow at the same time. We'll be back at 1:30 p.m. here on the Head On Radio Network. Thank you.